Okay, it's on the clock. Good morning. Let the record show that we have a quorum present, and I'd like to call the committee to order. Apologize for the late start because of the traffic issues in the eastern highway around Hurley's. Some of us were late getting in. But we have, today we're going to deal with the Auditor General's report, major capital projects, follow-up, dated October 2017. And at this time, I would invite the representatives from the Minister of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure to come inside the chambers.
Sincerely, I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truthfully declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give to this honourable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give this honourable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, and let me take the opportunity to welcome Mr. Tristan Hydes and his delegation who are here to give evidence on the major capital projects. And we have had proper apologies for Mr. Alan Jones, the chief officer who is traveling with the minister today. So without further ado, we'll get on, and just a little bit of house rules. First time you're asked a question, before you answer, just identify yourself with your name and title. And at this time, I'll ask the acting Auditor General to make a few opening remarks on the matter before the committee.
Mr. Chairman, members of Public Accounts Committee, officials from the Ministry of Finance, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Before I begin with my opening remarks, I would like to offer apologies also on behalf of Sue Winspear, the Auditor General, to the committee members and witnesses, as Ms. Winspear is unable to be here with us today. I'd like to begin by taking the committee members through the reasoning for conducting the audit work being discussed today, discuss some of the key findings, and highlight how we believe government could use these reports to improve how it manages public resources. I have with me today Ms. Angela Cullen, the Performance Audit Director, who led the audit work supporting the report you'll be reviewing today, and Mr. Julius Aurelio, the Audit Manager for Performance Audit. This performance audit was a follow-up of our two previous reports on major capital projects by my office that were published in 2012 and 2015. It focused on how well the government had responded to our previous reports and whether the actions taken had improved the management of major capital projects. The audit reviewed arrangements in place, carried out a high-level review of project documents for the 7 major capital projects that were live at the time of our audit. Exhibit 2 on page 7 of the report provides a summary of these projects. We timed this audit for 2017 as the government had a number of major capital projects underway and planned for the 5 years ahead. The estimated cost of these major capital projects is around $500 million. In addition, the government is planning to deliver 2 of these projects through public-private partnerships, generally referred to as PPP projects. This will be the first time the Cayman Islands government has ventured into alternative financing arrangements for capital projects. It is estimated that although the private sector partners will pay for the upfront construction costs, the government will pay lifetime operational charges of around $280 to $310 million to the private sector partners over 20 to 25 years. Our audit found that government had made significant progress in implementing the recommendations made in the previous reports in relation to governance and management of major capital projects. This is positive and welcome news. However, we also found that limited progress had been made in improving the budgeting frameworks, strategic planning for capital investment, or reporting information on the progress of major capital projects. I will provide a little more on these findings. Our audit found that the government has significantly improved its approach to project management since my office previously reported. It has established a center of expertise, the Major Projects Office, within the Public Works Department, and has staffed this with professional and experienced project managers. This is a welcome step and I believe a good example of functional leadership across government. However, the way it has been set up and funded poses some risks that could undermine its sustainability in the long term. The government has also developed a governance framework for major capital projects that is in line with recognized good practice and sets out the key stages and key decision points. The framework covers the fundamentals of good project management, although there are still areas where we believe it could be improved. For example, the framework did not set out any role for statutory authority, government company boards, or chief executives. This is a significant gap, especially where projects will be operated by and sit on the balance sheets of those SAGCs. Moving on to the application of the framework, the Major Projects Office started using the framework in December 2016. From our review of the 7 projects, we found that most of the projects had started before this date. Our audit had identified some of the project documents were not as comprehensive or robust as they could have been, or if they were to be prepared now in line with the governance framework. My office reported in 2015 that the budgeting process for major capital projects needed improvement. This has not happened. The budgetary framework and approvals process for major capital projects are still not aligned. Our audit found examples where insufficient budgets had been provided for some projects even though they had been given the go-ahead by Cabinet. Investing in major capital projects needs long-term commitment, as many take 4 years or longer to complete from start to finish. A certain and steady stream of funding is needed to ensure that the projects are delivered on time and within budget. Otherwise, they could be delayed or end up costing more than originally planned. Our audit highlighted the need for a long-term and capital investment plan. I strongly believe that the government should prepare such a plan to help inform decision-making, identify priority projects, the funding required, timescales needed to deliver them, and ensure that capital investment decisions are affordable in the short, medium, and long term. Having a large number of projects all reaching a critical stage at the same time could create challenges if sufficient capital funding is not available or potential suppliers cannot handle the volume of work. So it is important that this is well planned. This is increasingly important as government looks to alternative forms of financing for capital projects as well, which commit funds over the longer term. Finally, our report discusses the need for better information on major capital projects for the Cabinet and Legislative Assembly. Reporting back on progress and final outcomes is an important part of the accountability process. Our audit report includes 11 recommendations that we believe, if implemented, would further improve project governance and management and significantly improve the government's planning, budgeting, and reporting of major capital projects. These recommendations are set out in Appendix 3 on pages 42 to 47 of the report. I'm pleased to note that the government has accepted all of the recommendations made. In summary, the development of the project management's arrangements through the creation of the Major Capital Projects Office is a very positive improvement in managing major capital projects. However, there remains much to be done in developing an overarching capital investment strategy and to improve the budgeting and financial frameworks to ensure that major capital projects are adequately funded and value for money is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Acting Auditor General. We'll now open the floor up to questions. Mr. Austin, do you want to start?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to the members of the Public Accounts Committee, the audit team, and certainly the witnesses this morning. As we just heard from the Major Capitals Projects June 2012 Auditor General report and the subsequent follow-up report, October 2017, the Auditor General estimated the capital costs of major planned capital projects coming in around $500 million over a 5-year period to 2022. The Auditor General recommended the need for a standardized approach to project management. In mid-2014, the Major Projects Office was created, presumably in response to the Auditor General's report. However, the operation of that Major Projects Office is somewhat unique and speaks to the funding nature that the Auditor General's Office also just moments ago referred to. We understand the Major Projects Office is unique in many respects in that it's not a fixed body with fixed annual budget, but instead chooses to recruit project managers from ministries and SAGCs on a fixed-term contract. I wonder if the witnesses can explain, first of all, the rationale for setting up and funding the Major Projects Office in this way, if they are able to identify if there have been any complications in the current arrangement, and lastly, are there any plans to change the Major Projects Office in the way that it is organized, funded, and/or operated? And I'm happy to ask those questions again individually if the witnesses require.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Tristan Hydes, Deputy Chief Officer for the Ministry of CPI, Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure. First off, I'd like to reiterate my apologies for the Chief Officer who's on official travel. Thank you, sir. I'm going to turn it over to the one of the experts here, but the Director of Public Works. But I'm going to say that the ministry at the time and is still very much committed to the Major Projects Office. We see it as an integral part of not just public works, but infrastructure development as a whole in the Cayman Islands. It is essential and we are giving it all the support we can. And I think one of the major reasons why it's structured the way it's structured is for the flexibility of to take on projects as they come along. It gives us a lot more flexibility. Now, I'm going to turn it over to the director that he can add a little bit more to this specifically.
Good morning, Max Jones, Director, Public Works Department. I think the first question was probably why it was established in the way it was in the first place. There were challenges in getting the major projects staffing established initially. Government was in its period of austerity and new posts were hard to come by, and we were trying to work out how best to set this up. I think it's fair to say that project management for major projects is a part of the cost of delivering a project. So in order to get the project manager post established in the first place, we had discussions with the various ministries and statutory authorities. Simply put, Public Works didn't have those posts to hire those staff, and arrangements were made whereby the relevant ministry or statutory authority would hire the staff from the capital funding for the projects, which, as I say, is really a correct way for the funding to take place, because it is a true charge to a capital project. And then, by way of a service level agreement, those staff were seconded to Public Works Department. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but somehow we felt we had to get this major projects office kicked off, and that was why it was established in that way in the first place. Ideally, my strong view is that those staff, those project managers would be hired directly by Public Works. And the reason I say that is I believe at this point in time the Director of Public Works Department has the responsibility to deliver the project, the management on these projects, and to deliver the projects. And I therefore believe it's necessary that we have full authority over the staff. At the present time there's a slight split because they're hired not by us, by somebody else. Now, having said that, we're already underway in, it is accepted that this needs to change. So to date, we have transferred the senior project manager for airports, who was hired by the Airports Authority. He is now a Public Works Department employee, but he's not funded by Public Works. The funding is still coming from the major capital projects. So we have Public Works has a service level agreement with the Chief Executive Officer of the Airports Authority. So he is the senior project manager is now hired directly by us, but the funding is transferred through this SLA to make payment. This, I think, is quite an acceptable arrangement for it, because it gives us full authority over the employee, but it means that the funding is still getting charged back correctly to the capital project. So that's the first of those moves that's taken place, and we are in discussion as well on moving the others. So I believe probably by the end of this year, all or the majority of those staff will be Public Works staff funded by way of an SLA with the authority.
And thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. Through you, leading to the second question, outside of the difficulty, as you just mentioned, of having a project manager employed by one entity but working for the next, are there any other complications that demonstrated themselves from the establishment of the Major Projects Office that perhaps requires further fine-tuning?
There were certainly other complications with the staffing arrangements. For example, authorities have different benefit packages than government, and even between the authorities there are different benefit packages. So we certainly end up with a group of senior project managers, all with different vacation entitlements, different pension entitlements, and again, that's not an ideal situation when they're all working in the same office. So again, as they all move over to Public Works, that will all be rationalised, and everybody will be on the same terms and benefits, basically. Yeah.
And just a final follow-up. Obviously, there are some changes to the organizational structure of the Major Projects Office, as you've just identified. Are you able to say to this committee what is the timeline for completion for those changes, whether it be the the fixed project managers, the fixed annual budgets. When can we expect all of those other details to be finalized in your anticipation?
Yeah, we anticipate all of those changes taking place by the end of this year, and then all of those senior project managers would then, in terms of the budget, the funding for them, they would all be on an SLA where their entire costs, that's their salaries, their pensions, all their benefits, airfares, bringing them over, whatever it is, all of that will be charged back to the capital project, so it becomes a capital cost.
That contradicts the commitment given to the Auditor General in Appendix 3. Because in Appendix 3, for that recommendation, the commitment by the ministry was to have the one for the Civil Cayman Islands Airports Authority transferred by the 1st of October 2017, and to have the senior project managers for school, the waste management, and the cruise berthing project all transferred to PWD by 31st of March 2018. Is there any particular difficulties that that's now been put off for 9 months?
I think probably I should have reviewed what that section said before I responded. I'd have to say we're a little bit behind that schedule at the moment. There's nobody keener than me to do this as quickly as possible, because it's effectively public works management that suffers the complications that this causes. But I think, as you can imagine, there's an awful lot going on in the Major Projects Office at the moment. We're at key stages of a lot of projects, so we are a little behind that behind that schedule. But we will certainly be pushing to get it done as quickly as humanly possible.
Is any of that related to the fact that both of those, the birthing facility and the waste management, are going to be done under private, public-private partnerships? Is there a reluctance for who's providing the project managers in those two cases, the private sector or government?
No, the senior project managers are both government project managers. So on the cruise berthing project, the senior project manager is currently employed by the Port Authority, but seconded to Public Works Department. That is the next one that we're anticipating moving over to Public Works Department. We're targeting the statutory authorities first because their terms and conditions are the most different. Yeah. On the ISWIMS project, that is they're hired through the Ministry of Health, and again seconded to Public Works Department.
So, how is the accounting going to be handled to allow the project manager to be charged as part of the capital project if these are being managed by the private sector? Because as I understand it, government is not intending to be investing in the capital funds in either of these two projects.
The PPP consortiums will have their own project management, but it's essential that government also has a project manager overviewing that whole process. So I'm talking about the government project manager, yeah?
As an independent body,
yeah,
overseeing it.
Yeah,
and the government will be paying for that person.
Exactly. But all the project management for the PPP consortium will be their costs. So government always will have a cost on a PP project, because there's an awful lot of management through the life of that project to ensure things go well, yeah, and that it's being carried out in accordance with the contracts and requirements.
Any idea how you're going to handle legally, effectively, and practically that scenario where the private sector has their own project manager who says everything is going according to plan in Copacetic, and the government says, no, 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 it's not going, who's going to be the final arbitrator or who's going to have the authority?
Well, the legal contracts of PPP will lay out very clearly all the requirements. Not saying there won't be scenarios where legal interpretation will be required for that, but at the end of the day, it is the government that oversees these contracts. So it's government that will be deciding whether the contract requirements are met. If they are contested, if that is contested by the PPP, then there would be attempts to resolve that. But both sides also have their legal entities to resort to if it's not able to resolve that. We would hope those things would be resolved, but we know that's not always the case. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. What does the structure, at a very high level, what does the structure of the MPO looks like, the major projects office? I mean, how many staff and the basic structure?
Okay, so to my right is the Chief Project Manager. So Mr. Peter Ranger is the head office of the Major Projects Office. Peter reports directly to me as Director of Public Works. Peter has 5 senior project managers reporting to him, one for each of the major projects that is moving either in implementation or moving towards implementation. And we're about to take on a project administrator to support those. We're in the process of preparing to take on a project administrator to provide administrative project report to those senior project managers. We also have a number of employees that we second in and out of that major projects office because in the past at Public Works we've had to send employees overseas to get the kind of experience that's available on these major projects, and we certainly want to take maximum advantage of the fact that these major projects with professional staff on board are happening right here, and we want as much of that as possible to rub off on key staff in Public Works Department. So we have, for example, we have one young Caymanian staff who's spent a couple of years in the Major Projects Office. She's now moved out and has been promoted to Senior Project Manager within Public Works, and we have another senior member of staff just started for a 6-month stint in the Major Projects Office to gain that kind of experience.
Sorry, what I was trying to get at, and ultimately, with projects of this size, there's a lot of risk involved. And what I'm looking for is a structure that manages the various aspects of the risk that would be involved. So what I would expect at a minimum is that there would be certain basic functions that the MPO would have in place. And then, depending on the project, you will have someone kind of rolling in and rolling out as a more on the technical side. So what I'm looking for is like there's a base structure in place, then depending on the project. So I wouldn't expect someone doing something on the airport with their level of expertise will be the same person in solid waste management. But so I'm looking for the base structure first that manages risk. And the reason why I'm raising this is that unfortunately the government has built a reputation, and multiple government, not just anyone, that a project is going to cost 50 million, it ends up costing 100 million. And when you see projects go that far off, it normally means a lot of the risk that a project would have undertaken was not managed for or mitigated up front. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't get around risk. What I'm looking for is just to make sure that there's a framework in place to manage the various risks. So that is what I'm trying to get at. Because you can have a project manager. It doesn't mean if a financial risk shows up or a legal or performance type, or there's so many different risks that comes up. And that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of the management of that risk or the various risks.
We fully recognise there's major risks with all these projects that have to be correctly managed and mitigated. Would just like to point out that the 2 projects or parts of projects have completed so far under the Major Projects Office have had good performance in terms of cost and time. The John Gray High School gymnasium was completed on time and within budget, and the first phase of the Owen Roberts Airport was completed within budget, a little overrun on time, but was completed within budget. I'm going to hand over to the Chief Project Manager just to talk a little bit about how we manage risk and the consultants involved, which are the support structure to the Major Projects Office.
Thank you, Max. Pete Ranger, Chief Project Manager, Public Works. So to answer your question, it ties back to the governance structure. So if government wants to deliver a new project, for example, a school, it would come to Public Works, Major Projects Office, with an outline strategy and what we want to achieve. So our job then is to assist with what's called the strategic outline case. And in doing that, we must look at a long list of options, everything from not doing the work at all to do nothing, do minimum, and anything else in between. So at this kind of initial briefing stage, our job is to gather all the evidence on the need for the project, what the long-term ambitions are, in general, everything that you need to know about it. And also at that stage, what we also look to do is to put some high-level benchmarking costs in place, and it's one of the recommendations in the report which has now been put forward, so that when strategic outline cases come and is presented then to Cabinet with a project demand, at that point in time, we in the project office have gathered all the information that you need. At that point in time, if Cabinet wants to pursue ahead with the project to go to the next stage, which is called the outline business case, at that point, we would then hire in external consultants. And we then in the project office project manage on behalf of the government to deliver your requirements. So the OBC stage is really the point where we then go out to the marketplace, legal consultants, technical consultants, commercial consultants, to really take that long list of options and take it down to a short list of options and then come forward with a plan for government. And to me, the key issue of project management when you talk about project failures or cost overruns, normally when you track them back, they all track back to the very start. So we start off with a schedule which was too short, a cost which was wrong, etc., etc. So with a new framework, the first phase of a project, the strategic outline case, is really where we want to get down and say, you know, what does government want from this project? To give you an example, Georgetown Police Station, when we looked at that, you know, government comes and said we need a new police station. But in response to that question, the question we should be asking ourselves is, RCIPS, how do you want to police the island in the future? Do you want a range of smaller police stations? Is this a police station? Is it an administrative building? So really the SOC is the briefing point for us, where our job is to try and achieve the best value for money for government and give you all the options.
So then it begs the question, then where does the disconnect come from in a sense of, because one of the issues, I've been going through the budget process, and one of the things that the Auditor General raised is that when these projects are supposed to be completed, there's then you have the capital cost and there's the operational cost. Then the budget itself literally has excluded operational costs. So for example, I can tell you, looking at using the airport, for example, where you have the different phases coming, I would have expected, going through the recent budget process, where you'd have seen at least a good amount of cost increase on the airport side because you have a bigger facility. But at the same time, so what we're trying to get at is the connection then that once a project is completed, how does it then fits into the operational framework? Because it has now been raised where the operational costs now, or the ongoing operational costs of having a new project was actually excluded from the recent budget process.
Yeah, so as it says in the report, there's a slight disconnect. So from the SOC stage through to the OBC, in the outline business case, our job is to choose the margin, for example, 25 years, to give the CapEx and the OpEx. That's then in the OBC. We then move forward, we do our design, we deliver a project to the CapEx, but quite where that funding goes, if that makes sense, from the outline business case and to the product being delivered and then run by government for 25 years, that's where there's a slight disconnect.
And Mr. Chairman, through you, from the OPEX side, that's really with the entity, whether it's a SAGC or whether it's a government entity or a real government entity. But
So they can't just from the public standpoint, the public see government. And like I said, unfortunate, and what we're really looking for, I mean, and our purpose here is just to make sure that the risk is managed. And that's what we're looking for. Because at the end of the day, I would expect the airports authority depreciation expense to increase in terms of their budget because they have a bigger facility that requires more depreciation expense. And all we're looking for is to make sure that there is that level of connectivity. So, and that's really what it is just managing the risk. Because at the end of the day, these are very complex, very challenging projects. But at the end of the day, the public needs that assurance that, there is connectivity between all the government. Everyone is singing on the same sheet. Where you have not done a project, but then the money to operate it, you have not set aside any money to operate it.
Well, in all fairness, we do lay that out in the outline business case, both the CapEx side and the OpEx side. So the entities do know of their responsibility. I don't think I'm going to be qualified to speak to them and how they handle it once we deliver it. But, what we're responsible for is really delivering it to them. But they are aware of it and obviously should.
The challenge you have, Tristan, and I'm sorry for you, and this wouldn't go to the other guys, but for you, because your ministry now is the one that's actually signing these purchase agreements. So you need to know exactly what it is that you're also purchasing. Because I remember those big documents, they had the chief officer and the minister's signature on them. And one of the things that the budget process revealed is that the statutory authorities knew what they were selling. The ministries didn't know what they were buying. And it is that disconnect now that we need to start working on fixing. Now, I don't expect to get there overnight, but this is something I want to put out there because that was evident in the budget process where the expertise, and you see the thing about it is it impacts the governance. Because when I see the seller of a product come in here to explain it instead of the minister or the ministry, that frightens me. Because just like a vendor, it's like you going out, you buying something, and you're going to have the vendor to come inside and answer the question. That wouldn't fly. And in this case, the vendor is still the statutory authority. The ministry is still the person buying, or the entity that's buying. And what we need to make sure going forward is that the ministry itself, who has these overall responsibilities, especially now you have your public authorities law and everything else, where you now have more responsibilities, is that now you guys have a better governance in place. So there's no entity, because you're the ones that are signing off on the purchase agreement.
Agreed, but it's not always our ministry that is signing off on the OpEx side, right? I mean, it depends, as in the case of the airport, for say, it's the Ministry of Tourism.
Yeah.
But we do lay that out to them, and they are aware of it. So it's for them to manage and for them to speak to, I think. And going back to your original question, though, I think, one thing that we're also focusing in on at the MPO is our consortium of consultants. We want to build, while we have project managers that are project managing these projects, we want to build that consortium with expertise that we don't have to almost every individual project has to have a separate entity or a separate consultant. We have a sort of a consortium of consultants that we can pull from and manage the overall projects better. And I think that's the point of the MPO, to sort of find those synergies and take advantage of them.
The consortium you're referring to, you're talking internal to government.
Yes, our consultants.
Yeah, one of the things I can tell you I'm fearful of too is that every time you have a project and you bring in someone from outside, the knowledge that we would have remained in-house has now gone back to somebody else to get that experience, and we would have lost that.
No, that's what we've exactly.
Okay, so we say consultants because I just wanted to make sure we were clear.
Yeah, it
When you
depends.
say consultant, it wasn't someone external.
No, it not necessarily, but it could be. For instance, in a legal case or financial case, we might have to draw on those outside consultants, but they are our consultants. And what we try to do in most cases is when we do that, we try to assist from a government perspective in building our expertise up as much as possible, so that eventually we will have that consortium to have for ourselves.
Well, going back to the several project managers that you have in office, I'm assuming now, I think the 5 or 6, I think that was, you said several?
5.
5. Those are all full-time government employees.
Yeah. Yes, but again, that is sort of the flexibility of the MPO. They are for the life of the project. It's not intended that because obviously they're expert to that project. So once that project falls away or becomes operational, then that transitions on. So it really depends on the expertise.
They follow into the operational phase when it's finished. So they get seconded, and let's say go back to the airport, the in-house knowledge that they would have picked up in the MPO has now gone back to Owen Roberts to continue on the operational side.
I'll let the director speak.
Just to clarify a little, so the senior project managers we employ, they are high-level expert project managers. They generally only do major projects. If we move to a phase where government is not doing major projects, we will not hold them, nor would we have the work to justify their salaries. Yeah. So they come in for the projects. They will all stay on for a period after the project to manage final accounts and to see the project is fully closed off. But unless government has more major projects going on, and certainly just to clarify at the moment, I've worked at Public Works, it'll be 35 years in April, and I've never seen us doing this volume of major projects. In the past, it's been one major project here, a little bit of a gap, 2 projects, back down to 0. We've never had the continuity of major projects to keep these major project staff on a full-time basis. These are people that often move from one country to another, just carrying out major project management. So we won't necessarily keep them forever, no, very simply put.
Sorry, just to add to what Max said there, is that the whole purpose of the chief project manager and the governance structure and everything else is to put a process in place so that in the future, government's got a project to do, it comes to Public Works. Public Works then assesses a project, says, I've got staff in-house who can do it. Depends on the complexity. Then, if they don't have staff in-house, if it's something like a cruise berth for an airport, which is specialist, then they'll look to bring those people in. But the whole remit now of bringing staff through the offices is that in the future, 3-4 years' time, these projects are finished and everybody leaves, the whole process, the MPO and everything else sits within Public Works with staff who've worked on it, so that if there's a 2-year break or a 3-year break, all that knowledge is not lost. So part of the remit of the chief project manager is to do the governance structure, standardise, and then get procedures in place that are Public Works documents, again, for future projects.
Mr. Chairman.
A follow-up on again, going back to the acceptance of the recommendations, the Deputy Governor was to have issued a policy directive by the 31st of December 2017 to chief officers and heads of SAGs that all major projects are to be adhered to the governance framework of the Major Project Office. Can anybody confirm that policy directive has been done?
I can confirm that the policy directive is drafted and ready to go out. There's a further recommendation about modifying the governance structure to make it more appropriate for statutory authorities as well. We have a draft of that. We didn't want the directive to go out until we could send out both.
Just for my and the public edification, why is there a different approach to major project management for central government and for SAGCs?
There's not necessarily a difference in the project management approach, but the governance structure lays out all the sign-offs at various timeframes. So, for example, when the strategic outline case is complete, it must go to, in the case of a government project, to Cabinet for sign-off. It goes to the Chief Officer approval and to Cabinet prior to moving to the next stage. In a statutory authority, you have a different situation with the Chief Executive Officer and the board. So it's just a case of changing the language slightly because it has to have a board approval.
Are you saying that SACGs are allowed to take on major capital projects at executive level without board and cabinet approval?
No, I'm saying that the sign-off phase for each of the stages it's not a chief. It's just different entities signing off and working out. Is it the chief executive officer that has the authority to sign off at this point, or does it need to go to the board and then cabinet? And that was what the audit report was pointing out, that the first governance structure that was done was very much using just the terminology as if it was a government project. So there's just some slight massaging of the terminology, and we've made those a draft of those changes within Public Works Department, and it's currently with the statutory authorities, and we just need to get their feedback to make sure that they're in agreement with it. And at that point, the Deputy Governor, who has his directive drafted, will send that out with the what we thought at one point might be two separate, but we think now just one governance structure that has small areas applying to statutory authorities versus government.
So you're not likely then to meet the 31st or the 1st of March deadline to have all this on your website available for all and sundry if you haven't gotten the directive issued?
We believe we will still meet that date. Our aim was to put it on the procurement website, so anybody interested in procurement that's the first place they would go. The procurement office, their website is about 2 weeks from up and running. It's not actually up and running yet, so no, we still believe we can meet that 31st of March deadline.
Mr. Chairman, through you. Gentlemen, thank you very much for those answers. And I want to be careful with my questions so as to not sound critical, but I am seeking some elucidation on this point as it relates to costs. I preface it by stating what the Auditor General defined in terms of the Major Projects Office in their 2017 follow-up report by stating that the MPO is a good example of functional leadership across the government. But what my colleague, Mr. Saunders, was asking in terms of your fixed costs, the number of employees or staff that are permanent to the MPO versus the consultants that are brought in. We have seen in the past where the Auditor General makes a recommendation, which the government's response is the formation of a new department or office. And over time, that office, because of its funding or staff complement, they become funding behemoths, just like another department. And that's taking money from the government coffers itself. Notwithstanding the fact that, by all indication, we are on the precipice of another development boom, and therefore, as you've quite rightly identified, the Major Projects Office is quite busy. But can you identify to this committee what your fixed costs in terms of staff of the MPO are as compared to the consultants or other additional staff that are brought in that may not necessarily, that are there on fixed term contracts as opposed to fixed term costs?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So at the present time, we have the Chief Project Manager and the future Project Administrator that would be direct government employees. And as we've mentioned, we're bringing the other senior project managers over to government. I don't have all the costs off the top of my head for that, but all of those costs are going back to the individual project. None of the costs sit on government recurrent budget. So the entire MPO is charged back at an at-cost basis to the relevant client project. So it all gets capitalized as part of the capital cost. I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
Yes. I'm trying to determine, obviously, perhaps the labor costs associated with your office that require annual funding from the government, and obviously trying to determine whether those costs will be fixed or on an annualized basis, expectations to form part of the budget, or whether or not those fixed-term contracts will be shared with SAGCs and therefore won't be a fixed cost to the MPO.
So none of those costs will appear on government's recurrent budget. The entire MPO is capitalized back to the capital project.
What is the amount that the MPO is capitalized at this point?
Probably the best way I can answer that is the values of the service level agreements we have with the clients, which covers all the costs. So the first project manager that's moved across from the airport side, we have an SLA with the client where they pay public works, and I'm guessing the numbers, this is salary, pension, all costs associated, somewhere 130, 140,000. So each senior project manager will, let's say, somewhere between 120 and 140,000. I just don't have the exact figures with me. We then have that's for the directly employed project managers to a particular project. We then have the more overhead cost of the office, which is the chief project manager, the future project administrator, and some office costs, computers, whatever. And we have a 300,000 a year SLA, which is shared between the different major projects that are underway. So again, in terms of the size of projects we're managing, I think the cost level is very manageable. If we were to compare that with what private sector project management costs would be, it's quite small, yeah?
Again, Mr. Chairman, forgive me, through you, just so I can understand it, if we've got 5 senior project managers at the top end of $140,000, plus another $300,000 for administrative equipment and whatnot, we're in the ballpark of $1 million. Is that a safe figure to state that that's what you're capitalized at?
Yeah, it's somewhere in that order, yeah? And again, just to bear in mind that typical private sector project management costs run in the order of 2% of the project. So when you look at the size of projects we're managing, I think it does present good value for government to do it the way we're doing it. And I think significantly better control for government as well, yeah?
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, through you, just to follow up so that the general public doesn't have a heart attack in listening to these numbers. But when the MPO was initially created in mid-2014, you had the role of project manager for the cruise berthing facility and the airport's redevelopment project. The John Gray High School gymnasium was added after that. Can you state to this committee the total number of projects at present that the Major Projects Office is overseeing, participating, or otherwise involved in?
We currently have 7 major projects on the books. And help me out here, Peter. We've got the cruise berthing, the airport, the ISWIMS, the John Gray High School, the long-term residential mental health facility, the new police facility, and the new courts facility. Now, the new police and courts facility are in the very early stages. They're pre-outline business case. The others are all moving along, yeah?
When you're dealing with the triple Ps and you're doing a strategic outline case, do you set limitations as to what the project can cost based on the problem that it's trying to solve, or is this wide open and whatever the PP agreement comes up with is acceptable as a cost to the project?
Yes, sir. So in the strategic outline case, we don't actually dictate the funding. So in the SOC, you'd have a project with a long list of options. At that stage, we wouldn't be saying traditional construction, triple P, or anything else. That would be the outline business case. And at that point, we'd have external commercial financial consultants to give us the numbers, so that if you're looking at as an option for procurement, you'd see the difference between triple P, traditional construction, etc., etc. So the SOC, we wouldn't be saying this has to be a triple P. It would really be the next stage for that.
But let me be specific, see if I can get the answer I'm looking for. We're told constantly over the last several years in Finance Committee and otherwise in this Parliament by the Minister of Tourism that the two piers are not going to cost $300 million, but they don't know what it can cost. Have you done a strategic outline case for the cruise piers? And is in that strategic place, is there some guesstimate, upward limitations, cost that the project cannot justifiably exceed, included in that outline business case?
Sorry, we're just confirming there. So yes, on the cruise berth, all of that was actually run through in the outline business case. So of our current consultants, as we move through our procurement phase, on the preliminary design that's been done and what's currently out to tender, we are still in line with those figures that are in the outline business case. And
Is there a particular reason why those numbers are military secrets?
No. So the figures for the OBC are not secret, but the way the funding works is the fact that in terms of a triple P, the bidders will bid back on how we're going to split the passenger usage fee. So that commercial element will be when the tenders come back, government will have different bids, which will be money coming from cruise lines, private equity.
Yeah, but I'm not, at this point, I'm not trying to get of how we're going to pay for it out of the public treasury. Because this idea that the piers are not going to cross the people of the Cayman Islands, anything you and I both know is a pipe dream. What I'm trying to get at is in doing the strategic business case, particularly in a case like the cruise piers, where we have had contracts signed for amongst the billet, does the strategic business case include a figure about which the PPP cannot come in? I.e., is if we were going to spend $600 million to build two cruise piers, I would suggest that that would not be acceptable as part of the strategic place because you've not got the income to service it.
Yeah. So just to go back to the outline business case, 'cause the outline business case is a public document and it estimates the cruise berthing project at, this is the construction cost, 150 to 180 million. So we are.
So don't want to repeat that number. You're saying that your strategic business case for the two cruise piers in Georgetown says that you believe we can build 2 piers in Georgetown Harbor for between 150 and 180 million dollars?
Correct.
And do you remember what the contract that was signed for the 2 piers 6 years ago was?
I don't recall, but I'm confident in our figures.
Pardon?
I don't recall, but I'm confident that the outline
If-
business
if I
case is...
recall, it was over 250 million, somewhere in that region. So we have had sufficient reduction in construction costs in Cayman that you can now come up with a strategic business case that prices a project below signed costs about 5 years ago, more than 5 years now, 7 years ago,
Yeah. So,
and you're confident in your figures.
well, what I can say is that marine engineers and experts in this field were involved in the outline business case. We now have different marine engineering consultants on board, experts in this area, and both those two costs are tallying. I can't speak to the veracity of the previous estimates and bids.
One other question: when you're talking about strategic business case and stuff for government-owned companies, do you have any involvement in the Cayman Airways procurement of new planes, and were you involved in developing any kind of strategic business case, outline business case for that activity?
No, sir, we were not involved in those at all, no.
On the solid waste management, the impression that the public got, including myself, was when the strategic case was being developed, it included going out for a triple P, but that triple P included dealing with the problem as it exists and solving that problem. Am I correct?
As in the problem of the existing dump?
Yes.
That's correct. The remediation of the current dump is included in that project, yeah.
So what has changed in that government in this financial period is removing, remind me, Chief, was it 16 million from the environmental fund to prepare the dump for the advent of the triple P?
No, on the Insolence project, for an outline business case through to procurement, government had to look at the landfill remediation. So as soon as the waste energy plant's up and running and all the garbage is diverted to that facility, again with the yard waste, etc., we can close the dump. Now, if we'd have taken the cost of the landfill closure into the triple P, it would have cost a huge amount of money over the life of the project. So government is actually paying for the landfill remediation through that fund.
So the change on the strategic plan is that your office believes that the government can save money if it pays for the remediation prior to the advent of the triple P.
No, it's actually part of the triple P, so it's within the financial model of the triple P. So the contractor will get paid when that landfill is remediated for the works, as opposed to putting it over the 25-year period.
And you're comfortable with that arrangement?
Yes, so we've got our external advisors, KPMG, have done the financial model, and it's a no.
Will that lead to a reduction in the triple P?
Yes, it will do.
And to whose benefit will that be? The private sector or the government?
To governments. To governments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you. Speaking of the major capital projects, I think 7 you mentioned earlier on that your office is presently engaged in. An article appeared in the local media in November of last year stating that the Cayman Islands, I quote, are in the midst of an unprecedented development boom with over 1,000 new projects approved for planning in 2017, followed by more than 700 in 2016. Obviously, these are not all major projects. But because our economy is largely based on development, I think this is good news. In 2012, the Auditor General report looked at the issue of the procurement process, particularly in major capital projects, to ensure fairness in the process and the ability for local Caymanian companies to participate. I think in 2012, the Auditor General report recommended that improvements be made to the procurement process to ensure that they are conducted in a fair and open manner and that they encourage competitiveness, but also ensuring that only qualified contractors with the capability to deliver contract requirements are successful. The Auditor General's office went on to mention and recommend improvements in both the oversight and the selection of bidders. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I wonder if the witnesses can state how the procurement process has since been enhanced to address the concerns raised by the Auditor General, which also have a wider public interest.
So probably best that I speak to how we will be carrying out the procurement on the major projects to give an idea. I think one of the points you raised, sir, was about involvement of local contractors. And of course, one of the concerns with these major projects, they are very specialized, so you're not expecting to find local contractors generally with the ability to necessarily, for example, the ISWIM is a very specialized project. So how we've dealt with that is we go through the procurement process. We go through a pre-qualification process first, where we advertise to identify contractors with the necessary capabilities, knowledge, and skills to deliver these projects. So we end up with a shortlisted group of contractors. Now, in both the pre-qualification phase and the procurement phase, to try and encourage the involvement of local contractors, there's a scoring system within each of these where they get a number of points. Let's talk to the pre-qualification first on their experience in the types of projects. So they have to present projects and they get a number of points for that. The experience of the team they're bringing to the project, the skills of their project management staff and engineering staff. But we also have a section where they will get points for involvement of local contractors. So that's how we try to motivate involvement of local contractors within these major projects, which, yes, it would be very easy for them just to all go overseas if we don't do something like that. So that's how we've tried to address that. I think generally speaking, particularly with these major projects, we are following best practice. The governance structure that we've developed details from start to finish of the project, all the key stages, sign-offs, and the direction we will follow. And the Auditor General's office has confirmed that the governance structure is what would be considered best practice worldwide. So we believe we are following good practice and procedures to ensure that the procurement is in accordance with government's laws and regulations, in accordance with best practice around the world. Yeah.
Is there any plans by the ministry to go to real public tendering and open tendering, as opposed to the secret form that we have now?
So, Mr. Chairman, if you could, are you kind of speaking to where the public can come and attend and see the public
I mean,
open?
you either have open public tendering, or you have what we have now, which is closed secret tendering, and the only thing the public hears about is the successful bidder. So the public has no way of knowing what the competition was. So, in my view, when I talk about public tendering, I am talking about tender documents being opened in front of the public, in front of the press, and the amount of each bid for that project announced publicly, so that everybody knows where the government selected.
John or Jack. So, Mr. Chairman, I think that's more of a question for CTC, but just
No, that's not a question for CTC, that's a question for your ministry or whoever puts forward the procurement law, because it is missing from the procurement law now. I filed an amendment that your minister wouldn't accept, allow it.
well, I'm gonna say this though. The tenders that are open now, all of the bidders get the costs of the project, and
But I don't. I don't care what the tenders get. The public, whose money you're spending, need to know.
I will take that under advisement, sir, and I will try to have my chief officer look into it and see how we can develop a strategy to
Well, I mean,
go towards what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I don't really think it needs a change in the law. I just think it needs a change in the policy of the way the CTC operates, right? But the general public now has no way of knowing whether the successful tender was 3, 4, 5 times the next tender, because they can't make any comparison.
And I've noted it, sir.
Okay.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, through you again. Just going back to the governance structure. The MPO's office is within PWD, correct? All right. What I'm trying to determine on page 324 of the budget statement, which is we're looking at item MP3, which says project management, and this relates to the Ministry of CPI. One of the quality underneath there says basically the projects will be overseen by the chief project manager within the ministry. Is there another chief project manager within the ministry, or? This has $1 million cost on it. So what I'm trying to get at, and just to put it out there, if you guys are capitalizing the costs that goes with the project, it means then that those employee costs generally then would have been covered in the project, and we would have voted on a capital budget separate, which would have included those costs. So then it means then there's also operational costs here for over $1 million, which per the budget document says within the ministry. So I'm trying to determine what that cost represents.
I think that refers, Mr. Chairman, through you, to separate project management costs for other related projects that the ministry is doing. I'm not really 100% sure of it, sir. It could be just a matter of verbiage that spilled over from how it had been structured in the past as well. I don't really have that document in front of me to be honest with you.
Okay.
Sir,
I could be
sorry.
I'll look into it though.
Yeah, no,
and
just a description. I mean, that says projects will be overseen by the chief project manager within the ministry. So that's what I was trying to understand if there was a duplication of the costs. But I mean, I can only go by what we voted on, what was
Right.
presented to us. Okay. All right.
Have there been any changes to the major project office since the Auditor General's report in October 2017?
No, sir. There has been no changes. Minor change. We have a temporary person in at the moment who's assisting with the project administration until we fully recruit that post. But other than that, the last senior project manager was recruited early 2017. Yeah, we recruited one senior project manager in early 2017. But I don't think since this report there's been any real changes to the major projects office.
The major project office has developed templates for SOCs, but strategic outline case, outline business case, final business case, or are those things done by the ministries and you try to fit your assessment of the project into their template?
So one of the things that comes out of the governance structure, for every project, there's a project steering committee, who are the body who are brought together to develop a brief and the scope. So in that steering committee, it's always, if it's a ministry, the chief officer, Mr. Jones, Director of Public Works, myself, Senior Project Manager, and other interested parties, be it be DOE, planning, etc. So in terms of documents, it coming in from all these projects being at different stages, we thought it would be quite a tall order to go in and start pushing standards on people when they're all at different phases. So what we've done is, as each project moves through a new phase, we develop a standard template. So for the John Gray High School, which was happening SOC while this audit was getting done, we now have a new standard strategic outline case that identifies all the issues that were in the report in terms of benchmarking costs, etc., etc. So what we now use is the next project that comes along, we'll be using that John Gray as a yardstick, because people don't really tend to respond to documents that are just generic. Whereas what we want to do is say, this is a good example of an SOC done under the new governance structure for John Gray. Another project comes along, we'd use that template. Same with the OBCs, etc.
Mr. Chairman, through you, just to follow up to that specific question. 2012, the Auditor General noted that a key missing element central to all major capital projects was a properly defined business case or strategic outline. The business case strategic outline was recommended in order to ensure that there are clearly established objectives and definition of need, the estimated project costs and delivery. But they also went on to recommend that, in their words, and I quote, an appropriate legal instrument to be in place prior to the commencement of a major capital project in order to better protect the interests of the Cayman Islands. And as an example, the Auditor General highlighted the major school project where none of this existed, and as a result of it, the country suffered in major cost overruns. Through you, Mr. Chairman, can the witness tell us what work, if any, has been completed in establishing the criteria as set out and or recommended by the Auditor General's office?
So there's probably two main areas of contract here. We're employing a lot of consultants on these projects. So we have a consultant template contract, which has been approved by legal, which we use as a basis for all of our consultant contracts. And again, just to specify that all contracts are different, so it's always developed from that. When we're getting into the major capital projects, and these are very specific and complex projects, particularly when we're looking at, for example, the PPPs, we have specialist PPP legal consultants, commercial consultants, so they're able to advise us, and these consultants have been selected because of their expertise in PPPs and their expertise in the particular type of project. So they basically advise us by getting the latest documentation on these projects. So we're generally working with state-of-the-art contracts that are coming out of the UK or other overseas territories. We do not have within the Cayman Islands those kind of contracts because we've never done these kind of projects before. But we're quite confident that through the consultants we are getting the up-to-date and most appropriate contracts for the projects we're doing. All of these also have to go through government legal department then as to ensure that they comply with local law, etc. Yeah.
But, Mr. Chairman, again, specific to the appropriate legal instrument that protects the Cayman Islands from cost overruns. In other words, the developer contractor says, we can build you a school for $100 million, and they outline this in their business case. What protection does the Cayman Islands have that $100 million won't turn into $150, $160 million, as, again, loosely using those numbers, but certainly evidence of this did happen in the schools project. Is there, in addition to your basic template, a separate specific legal instrument that defines the agreement to engage and commence in those capital projects to protect the Cayman Islands specific to cost and to avoid cost overruns?
I think it's fair to say there's no contract in the world that doesn't cater to variations and the like. So there's always, any modern contract has contractual terms to deal with how variations will take place. When the contractor signs the contract, he's committing to deliver what is showing on the drawings and the bills of quantities at that time. Changes take place. These can be client changes. These can be unforeseens that come up. You're excavating a foundation and suddenly you find a 15-foot deep soft spot that you have to excavate. It always is that you pay for those extras, because if you don't, if you throw that onto the contractor, he inflates his bid because he knows he's responsible for everything. So all standard contracts allow for pricing for what is known at the time, and then specifying very clearly a methodology for how you will then price any changes that take place. And yes, we certainly have those in place, and even at the project management level, we can't protect against client changes. If the client decides they want to add another classroom or this, that, or the other, there is an extra cost to that, and we're operating on the client's direction. But our job as project managers is to manage those contracts in accordance with the contract terms. Firstly, making sure the contracts are appropriate, and then managing the contract within those terms. Now, I just want to hit on the point that Peter mentioned earlier, because generally speaking, those contracts that overrun badly, it's not that when you've got to the point of awarding a contract, something goes drastically wrong afterwards. It's the lack of thinking up front, the lack of scope definition up front. And I think it's fair to say in the past, we have suffered from this sometimes, where there's been a rush to get the project done. So the designs are rushed, this is rushed. It is so important to allow the correct time frames. And major projects do take a long time. I think the Auditor General's report points out that the new government administration building was a successful project, but it was 4 or 5 years in the development. It takes time. So the most important part of all these projects is the thinking right up front to ensure first you know what it is you want to build and you've got client agreement, everybody's on the same page on what's to be built. And if you've got that firm starting point, you know what the scope is, as long as you're providing correct project management along the way, you're on a fairly safe bet. But it's the upfront thinking to make sure that the project that's on the paper is what we really want, and we don't find out further down the line that actually, well, that's not quite what we want something else, and that's when the costs escalate through the roof. Yeah. But again, I would say I'm very confident with the Major Projects Office that we've got the right people in place with the right knowledge and the right skills to manage these projects, because of course that's one of the other keys, having competent project management on these projects, so that when variations are taking place, they're correctly recorded, they're correctly costed, so that you keep control of those things. So strong project management is a key feature for mitigating some of these issues. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you very much for that answer, Mr. Jones. I'm not sure if you guys have access to the report that we had received from the Auditor General, but I'm kind of glad to hear your answer a while ago, because I'm looking, just for the sake of the public, the key stages and milestones they have in the MPO governance framework for major capital projects, and this is on page 13, is you have the strategic outline case, or the SOC, then you move to the outline business case, then you have a develop preferred option, and there's a final business case, then there's construction, then completion, handover, and operation, and then post-completion and evaluation. So it starts with the strategic outline case, then it moves to outline business case. But when I move to page 19, which is the assessment of the 7 projects that is being done, under the strategic outline case, of the 7 projects, not one of them complies with the governance framework within the basic interception. Then you move to the outline business case. Except for, well, the John Gray, the integrated waste management, the cruise berthing, and the long-term mental health facility, those complies with the governance framework. But I'm trying to understand, on the strategic outline case, it didn't comply, but on the outline business case, it actually complied. Maybe this is something that maybe the auditors can probably explain to me within the different steps where it didn't comply in the strategic outline, but it complied in the outline business case. And that's just for my own understanding. Sorry, maybe that's not directly for you guys. Maybe it's more on the auditor's side. Their report.
And Angela Cullen, Director of Performance Audit from the Office of the Auditor General. Just to clarify through you, Chair, the point. As we say in the report, most of the projects that we looked at had started before the MPO's new governance framework was in place and was started to be implemented. But we did compare the documents that we had against that governance framework. So at the time we looked at the SOCs that had been developed, none of them complied with the requirements that there are now in the MPO's own governance framework. Now, that's not to say that new projects, and Mr. Jones made reference to the John Gray High School Phase 3, that they've taken on board the comments that we've made in this report and the SOC for that phase of that project should now, if we went back and looked at it, have a tick and comply with their own framework. So it's as projects move through the phases. So because some of these were developed quite a while ago, they didn't comply with what we would expect to see now. The outline business cases were a better quality, but because some of them were much more recent, and the SPMs within the MPO had been heavily involved in the development of those OBCs.
Thank you very much. Then this now brings to my other question. The initial SOCs, were they prepared by the external consultants or were they done internally by government?
If I can answer that at the same time, so just adding a little comment. I think it's necessary to understand the history of the MPO. The MPO historically, Public Works did the majority of government capital projects, and then we've gone through this period where capital projects were carried out by other means. And we kicked off the MPO, and it was basically my good friend Jim Scott, who's no longer with us, and myself. We were the staff of the MPO at day one, yeah. We didn't have quite the experience of a lot of the expert staff we have at the moment. So we, in SOCs, PPPs, all these kinds of projects. So we, along with members of the steering committee, produced the initial SOCs. I don't think we did a bad job, but it didn't meet everything that we're now
Sorry.
looking for with more knowledge. Yeah.
Actually, I don't want to like prolong it. What I wanted to just make sure is that we didn't pay anybody externally.
No.
So
They were
that's
done
fine.
They were done
Yeah,
in house.
so,
Yeah.
That's all I just need to make sure. What I was really getting at
Yeah.
was to make because I saw other ministries
Mm-hmm.
purchase SOCs.
No, no.
So I just wanted to make sure that we didn't go outside. So
Sure.
that's cool. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah. And the
I'm
main
fine.
miss was that we weren't costing SOCs at
Yeah,
that time.
and
We
that's
now
fine.
cost SOCs. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all, Mr. Tristan, and your team for coming.
Thank you.
And if we could have the Minister of Finance and Economic Development representatives. Mr. Jefferson and Ms. Owens. We don't have too many. I don't think we have too many questions for you all. I guess the major question is, how are we progressing the adjustments that are needed to the budgeting process to allow for this, to use your phraseology, OPEX and CAPEX and these major projects? And are we looking to move to the position where a project is budgeted in its totality, even if it's allocated annually, so that there's an understanding and expectation that we have some money this year, but there has to be money next year, which will be carved out of government's revenue prior to any divvy up of monies for capital, so that we have continuity of project.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's now good afternoon to you and the committee members. Mr. Chairman, would you wish for me to take a affirmation or?
No, that's okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for that vote of confidence, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to start with some very brief opening remarks to say that certainly the Ministry of Finance welcomes the report by the Audit Office now before the committee because its intentions are good and positive. We see them as a report trying to suggest to government how it can improve its capital appraisal, how it can improve its capital budgeting, and very importantly as well, how it can improve the reporting of information with respect to capital, to Cabinet, reporting to Cabinet, reporting to the Legislative Assembly, and reporting to the public. Mr. Chairman, to answer your question, sir, the reality is now that we have set in place budgets for the calendar year 2018 and the calendar year 2019. The reality is also, Mr. Chairman, that for the 2018 financial year and onwards, the law has been, the public management and finance law has been changed so that the government is now obliged to report to the Legislative Assembly and to have financial information gazetted as well with respect to each quarter. And so, you know, the quarter ending the 31st of March 2018, we are legally obliged to present financial information 6 weeks later, so by mid-May. We see that as the first opportunity to improve the quality of information, the extent of information, particularly with respect to capital expenditures. We've heard from the major project officer office, from Chief Officer Mr. Hydes, that in terms of capital expenditures and operating expenses, that office in particular does help in the specification of both elements of cost, where certainly we have, in government as a whole, have fallen down is not reporting to any great extent beyond up until now, the 1 year horizon for an annual budgets. So we see appropriations being made for 1 year to, you know, construct a major project with very little information about what happens in year 2, year 3. We see the upcoming May deadline for reporting as an opportunity to repair that damage, and we certainly intend to do so. It will require quite a bit of work in terms of getting the information from agencies so that we are able to report. And for future budgets as well, we have the opportunity time-wise to, but not a lot of time, to improve the budget information for the financial years 2020 and 2021. You know, it's quite, I think, startling to know that the next strategic policy statement is actually due next year, the 1st of May 2019. The strategic policy statement for the financial years 2020 and 2021 is actually due next year. So what I said, we have the opportunity time-wise to improve budget information and so forth. That's true, but it's not an unlimited, obviously, period of time. But we certainly do acknowledge that it's important that the budget documentation actually shows quite clearly the history, the life, the time it takes to complete a project, the capital costs involved, and the operational costs involved. Mr. Chairman, we also note too that one of the recommendations in the report deals with the specification of a capital development fund. That might not be the precise term, but it's clear that that recommendation is suggesting that unused appropriations at the end of a financial year don't expire, but they can go forward to the second year and the third year. That, Mr. Chairman, is I think something that obviously the government would seriously consider. Obviously, the Public Accounts Committee may wish to make that as a recommendation, and obviously government has to respond in the government minute. That would require a fairly simple change to the Public Management and Finance Law, which presently states that appropriations expire at the end of the financial year. So I wouldn't, I'm going on quite a bit, Mr. Chair, I think the government would be obviously very reluctant to say that all appropriations can carry forward indefinitely. I think the government would be more comfortable with the capital expenditure carrying forward, but the recurring expenditure expiring at the end of a financial year. because otherwise it becomes extremely difficult then to keep track of the financial position of the government. If all appropriations can carry forward indefinitely in the future, it becomes very difficult to achieve that. But certainly it's the Capital Development Fund concept is something I think the government can look at.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. One of the things that came out of the Auditor General report was the disconnect between when a capital project is finished and then the operational cost. One of the things I was curious about is during the strategic outline case or the strategic outline case or the outline business case, I'm assuming that within those business cases, there are sections of finance to sign off on with regards to the numbers or some of the financial assumptions used. What I'd like to know is that does the Ministry of Finance sign off on those in terms of the numbers, or is that done at a different ministry level? But what we're trying to make sure is that there's some level of connectedness, because if you guys have visibility on what is being signed off in terms of the financial numbers, then at least when the budget comes around, you guys will know for it to be included. So the question is are you guys signing off on the financial models or the financial assumptions that are used in those, whether it be the strategic outline case or the outline business case?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the honest answer is that the Minister of Finance generally does not get asked that specific sign-off procedure for us to carry that out when the strategic outline business cases are being done. Under the Project Future methodology, individual teams can look at specific plans for their particular ministry, and the costs, indications of costs are included in those documentations. I sit as a part of the steering committee group on the Project Future, and would see such details where they're present. If the project then proceeds to the point where it gets included in the annual budgets, it is not often the case that, like I said, the history of the future costs of the project is outlined in any great degree. It's usually the 1 year horizon, the 2 year horizon now that gets included.
Thank you very much. The reason, this definitely then begs a question, because like with any business case, there's also be the legal aspects of it. And I would like to at least know that the Attorney General office is at least signing off on business cases. And if that is the case, I have to make that assumption, that at least the government legal advisor is doing that part of any business case where you'll have the legal aspects of it. And if that is the case, then wouldn't the same apply for finance? Whereas the main finance person for government would also be doing the same thing that the Attorney General would be looking at. Because I'm making an assumption. I don't know if the auditors can tell me if the Attorney General is actually signing off on the legal aspect of these business cases. Unless I'm assuming there's a legal risk management within these business cases. Let me start with that assumption. Are there financial risks and legal risks included in these business cases as would be expected in the best practices? And then if so, who's signing them off?
Through you, Chair. Yes, business cases should have financial and legal implications in each of them. I can't answer whether the Attorney General is signing off on the legal aspect of the legal part of those business cases before it goes to Cabinet. I don't know. I can find out. Yeah.
Just a follow-up. Years ago, before you could take a capital project forward to cabinet. It used to go to the Private Sector Investment Committee, which was then a sign off was therefore required from finance that that project could fit into the government's budget and it could be funded prior to it going to and now would be going to the major project office for strategic. But at some point in time, I would hope that there is a requirement for finance to look at the numbers and determine whether the country can afford it or not before we go to this elaborate process.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you're absolutely right. The Public Sector Investment Committee is still a legal requirement under the financial regulations. The threshold for the committee to look at government expenditures is quite low. It's $300,000 and up, and it's not restricted to capital construction projects. The financial regulations actually define what the capital project is meant to be. And so it actually simply says in the regulations that a capital project is any item that will be capitalized on the balance sheet. So if an agency goes out and purchases a fleet of vehicles, that's a capital project for the purposes of the investment committee, PAC. The honest answer, Mr. Chair, to you and the committee members is that PAC is not in operation. And I'll attempt to explain why. I think it's fairly easy to establish the committee in terms of putting persons forward. The regulations actually say that the purpose of the committee is to advise cabinet via the Minister for Finance on the viability of capital projects, and it then lists the areas that the committee would look at in determining if it's viable or not. It talks about the economic aspects, the financial aspects, the environment, and so forth. What has, I think, prevented the formation of, or the operation of PAC is simply, one of timing. Up until thus far, the actual budget process would frustrate the operation of PAC. We have the strategic policy statement just prior to now. It was due on the 1st of December each year. We then moved into the new calendar year, and around February, March, we then went into preparing for the full year budget that was going to start on the 1st of July. Those dates have now changed. But what has happened up until now has been that the civil service, the government as a whole, has not been forthcoming readily in presenting projects for the PAC's consideration. And you only get an indication of what would be agreed projects for placing in the upcoming budget when it's very close to the budget date. And so there was time-wise, there would be very little opportunity for the committee to consider, a multitude of projects, the viability of them, and to report to cabinet. So it's easy to establish. I think it's fairly easy to establish the committee, but it's the timing of projects becoming available to the committee so that it could carry out its function in a timely way. If you ask me, well, if the committee says, well, what's going to change now?
But if I recall correctly, before a ministry or a department could request funding for an investment, there had to be some referral and consideration by PAC. Because I agree with you, if you're going to do it after I've submitted a request on a budget, it's meaningless.
Right.
I think the reason for it was that you made sure that there was some consideration of all of those factors, the viability, the economic impact, whether government was likely to afford it, whether it actually addressed the problem that you solved, the problem you're trying to address. Because many of these projects don't necessarily fix the problem in the end. And it used to be that was a pre-requirement, as I recall. Why was it changed, and when was the PSIC abandoned?
Mr. Chairman, I think I would probably struggle to answer those questions. I do know that in 2004, 1st of November, I became the Financial Secretary, and PSIC has not operated since then. I think it might have been around in 1999, thereabouts.
I'm talking 88, 90, 91, 92. So
Okay.
I have a pretty good idea of why it wasn't continuing to function, and it was usually a political decision as opposed to any justifiable governance structure adjustment.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I certainly don't, I'll be quick. I don't want to leave the impression with the committee or the public that the projects are not reviewed. Obviously, there's a strategic policy statement process in which ministries and portfolios will actually come before ministers of government, present what they wish to undertake in the course of an upcoming year, and that is often over a day or two process. I will say fairly that in those presentations, there certainly is an indication as to what the costs are for the upcoming year, and oftentimes there will be a total cost as well. It mightn't be split out into year 2, 3, 4, but there's an upcoming cost in the next financial year and a total cost. There are indications as to what the operational costs are as well, not always. And those costs, Mr. Chairman and committee members, are very often beyond what the government can afford. And so those plans are severely reduced because of government affordability issues. And so out of that process, we do get a strategic policy statement with absolute monetary values for expenditures for the immediate financial year upcoming and the 2 years beyond that. We then take those limits to expenditures for agencies, ministries, portfolios, offices, and up until recently, around February, March time, those absolute amounts are then used to prepare detailed budgets. Projects then emerge, February, March time for cabinet's consideration, caucus consideration, and being brutally honest, Mr. Chair, oftentimes the limits that were established in the strategic policy statement, the requests coming forward exceed those limits. And so there's another round of trimming back by honorable ministers and backbenchers to get the requests from the detailed budget preparation stages back to close proximity to the strategic policy statement numbers. So, although a project may not be now formally sent and reviewed by a non-existent PSIC, there is scrutiny. And I did.
Yeah, the problem I'm trying to eliminate is that presentation that you get when you publicly state in the strategic policy statement what projects and what they're going to cost. But then invariably when you get to the actual budget preparation, there are all kinds of other things thrown in, and then there's a re-evaluation of priorities which should have taken place prior to the strategic policy statement being made. And the value of the PSIC when I was in government was that happened prior to, and therefore you didn't have to make that second round of adjustment.
Yes.
question, Mr. Chairman, just following up. I'm trying to understand if the PSIC is still in the regulations, then from the audit report standpoint, no. I'm trying to understand the OBC, the part that says complies with governance framework. Wouldn't that, in essence, then, if that part is required and wasn't done, then wouldn't it automatically means that the outline business case does not comply with the governance framework? I'm just trying to understand.
Good question, and thank you for asking for clarification through you, Mr. Chair. The governance framework, the MPO's governance framework that it has drafted, actually at the moment doesn't include a requirement to go through PSIC because PSIC doesn't exist. But it is in legislation. You're absolutely right. So there is. They've taken a pragmatic approach because it doesn't exist, that there's no requirement because then all of them would fail. If PSIC was set up and established under the legislation, that step needs to be added into the governance framework. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just comment, it certainly is the intention of the Ministry of Finance to resurrect PSIC. We were having a discussion as to, where that would fit in the process. So if I could, as just a sort of a discussion area, draw the committee attention to page 6 of the report, where it speaks to the Exhibit 1 key stages of good project management. Having a discussion within the Ministry of Finance about where PSIC is best placed within that scheme there. So we see, first of all, developing the strategic outline case, develop outline business case, and so forth. So where would PSIC approval or review fall within that? Initially, we feel that PSIC, the review by PSIC could actually take place after the outline business case. There is obviously, considerable possibilities of overlapping of work between the major project office, the things that they would look at, the information that they would input. There's potential for overlap between PSIC and the stages prior in the development of the strategic outline business case and the outline business case. So we do want very quickly to sit with the major project officers office amongst other agencies to decide where is a good place for PSIC to first have its input.
I would suggest that PSIC should take place prior to the strategic, because, and maybe I'm off base, but I see PSIC as a more general and less detailed and specific exercise in determining what government is willing to invest its money into and what it can afford. Once the government sets the areas that it is willing to invest and it can support financially, then I think it should go to the strategic thing, and there's where the details of that particular project.
So just thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to be, I say, absolutely clear. The Ministry of Finance will be resurrecting the PSIC.
Thank you, Chair, through you. I think it's a good discussion to have with the Ministry of Finance and between the MPO and looking at where PSIC could play a role. I think it's important that it plays a role at the right times, and the strategic outline case, the outline business case, and the final business case are all commitments to spend money. So the strategic outline case, now that it includes an estimated cost, and it will be a very initial estimate, it's generally an approval. If that is approved, it's approving go ahead and employ consultants to develop an outline business case, which may cost somewhere between a few $100,000 and more. So actually there's a commitment then to spend money. At the outline business case approval stage, that is a commitment to spend a lot more money. So that's you getting into, yes, we're moving into the procurement phase, we need to spend a lot more money, and final business case is generally before the construction contracts are signed. So that is the big commitment before you could be spending anywhere between 10 million and $300 million. So it's important that PSEC plays a role in all of these stages when there are commitments to money that actually will affect potentially the next year's budget and future years' budgets also.
Well, I'm happy to see that it's actually being resurrected. But one thing I would like, I guess, for the Ministry of Finance to consider is the different, the inclusion of the finance sign-off and the legal sign-off just for completeness. Because one of the things, again, I mean, you're looking at the budget, and what we find is that disconnect between when these projects are finished and when the budget is coming through. And we need to just make sure we tighten that up a little bit. And I'll feel a little bit more comfortable, and I'm sure the country will feel a little bit more comfortable to know at a minimum that the financial secretary and the attorney general at a minimum has some sign-off somewhere in the process. So at least there are no surprises. I mean, in an organization, any business case, you'd have the legal person and the finance person signing off on it. I don't see why the government should be any different. So that's just something to consider as we try to tighten up the governance model.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, just very quickly, before Mr. Harris speaks, to say that, again, the opportunity now has presented itself for work to be done by PSEC. We obviously have a 18 and 19 budget now with projects included within it. And so I think it's what has lacked the functioning of PSEC in the past has been perhaps the lack of a push by persons within the civil service to actually resurrect it. I think along came the FFR with the disciplines that imposed upon us. So the civil service has now gotten into the regime of outline business cases and strategic outline cases, which is essentially what the present financial regulations require chief officers to present to PSEC for its review. So we've gotten accustomed now to these business cases scenario, which wasn't around before. But I think it's now myself and the Deputy Governor pushing chief officers and agencies to say, you shall present information for the Public Sector Investment Committee to review.
Mr. Chairman, through you, speaking of the commitment to spend money, and for those of you following along, this question is in reference to Appendix 3 of the Major Capitals Follow-Up 2017, October 2017, recommendation number 8, which is found on page 45 and 46. It notes that some of the capital projects will be funded through alternative financing methods such as the public-private partnerships. And under that agreement, as I understand it, construction costs will be paid for by private sector partners, whilst government will be paying for the annual operating costs. Examples of this PPP can be found in the cruise berthing facilities, the integrated solid waste management, and perhaps others. The Auditor General also noted that most or some of these major capital projects will span periods greater than 4 years, or your typical election cycle. Therefore, it is entirely possible, if not regularly happens, that we have a project started by one administration but completed by another. In recommendation number 8, the Auditor General's Office noted that they could find no evidence to ensure that budgets cover the entire life of the project and that full life costs are built into the current and or future budgets. And they've even gone on to recommend that perhaps the creation of a reserve fund might be considered, which would be ring-fenced throughout the life of that contract. I wonder through you, Mr. Chairman, if the witness might explain what, if any, methods have been employed to address this gap, which serves, in my opinion anyway, to ensure value for money on the significant public expenditure that these major capital projects represent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As always, the best answer is the honest answer. We have just embarking on consideration for the triple Ps in government, and I should say upfront that it should be clearly understood, and I'm not referring to the committee members, I'm speaking more generally to the wider public, that the real purpose of entering into public-private partnerships should never be about taking debt off the balance sheet of governments. That should never be the objective. The objective of public-private partnerships should always be that it is more cost-effective, more cost-efficient for a private contractor to provide a needed service than the government itself can do so. That is, to me, the real objective. It's not about keeping debt off the balance sheet, which I think it's been accepted now that the triple Ps arrangements are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to not be regarded as debt. They are debt. Mr. Chairman, to attempt to answer Mr. Harris' question, the approach has to be that we've heard from the major project office that in developing outline business cases, etc., for projects, that operational costs and capital costs are available. Unfortunately, those those types of informations are not forthcoming from the individual ministers' portfolios when detailed budgets are being prepared. But it has been said to the committee that those pieces of information do exist. What the government can do is to obtain those pieces of information, place them in its annual budgets, to make it clear to MLAs, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to the public what the total cost, capital cost, and operating costs of a project over its entire life will be. And if a decision is made to proceed with such a project, then everyone is aware of the full cost. And if there is then a change in government before the project is complete, an incoming government would obviously be aware of what the cost implications are and would have to make the decision whether to continue the project or to discontinue the project. So the answer is to the member's question is a plan, an intention to include such costs in budget documentation in the future so that everyone can be aware of it. I think also Mr. Jones earlier on made the very important point that perhaps the most critical point is the careful review of what essentially is going to be the guiding document that governs these relationships, to carefully review and take us whatever time is necessary to do so, to scrutinize the provisions and the sections within those documents. Because once signed, those become essentially your guiding principles, your cost restrictions, your legal obligations. So the important thing would be to pay careful attention to what those draft agreements are saying. If I haven't addressed the members' questions, I'd be willing to try again.
Mr. Jefferson, I firstly must thank you for that very honest answer. And I think it is also important for potential partners of the government to recognize that it is also incumbent upon them to make sure it happens. Because if you find yourself in a situation where that process isn't followed and the government change, the private contractor must also recognize now that they stand a chance of being exposed and being caught out. Because at the end of the day, I mean, a parliament by itself is it's a parliamentary supremacy or parliamentary sovereignty, where no current government can bind a future government or whatever. So the message has also got to be to the public that you guys need to make sure that this is also followed. Because if you try to embark on an unpopular project and try to think you can squeeze something in prior to election and the government change, there's a very fat chance that that project may be stopped and you may be caught out too. So I think at the end of the day, what you're saying is completely correct, where these are the times where the public need to be fully on board and fully made aware of what it is that the country is embarking on. And I've said it before and I've said it again, the public business cannot be done in private. So I think at a minimum, that message needs to be sent. And I'm glad, I just want to say thanks very much for your answer.
Any other question? If not, thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson, and we look forward to all these things being done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members.
Thank you all, and the meeting is adjourned until February the 21st. We'll get notices in the meantime. I mean, closer today. So the meeting is adjourned at 1:45. Thank you all very much.